with the panelists. And now I'm pleased to introduce the moderator of our panel, Anthony Dieris. Is the author of The Language of Men, a memoir, published by Hudson Whitman Press in 2012, which received the Penn Discovery Prize and Forward's Memoir of the Year Award. His work has appeared in McSweeney's, Boston Magazine, Solstice, Shelf Awareness, The Literary Review, Memoir Magazine, Sports Literate, Flash Fiction Magazine, and elsewhere. He currently directs the low-res MFA in Creative and Professional Writing at Western Connecticut State University. So I will hand it over to Anthony. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. And thank you to the Connecticut Literary Festival for hosting our panel and for all of you for coming today. The way that we've decided to organize today is I will introduce each of our panelists. Each one will speak for a little bit, share some of their work. I have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask them, but we really want to leave plenty of time for all of you to ask questions and really have a discussion. So I will begin with the writer to my left. Molly Gaudry is the founder of LitPub and the author of the verse novel We Take Me Apart, which was a finalist for the Asian American Literary Award and shortlisted for the Penn Osterwil, and its sequel, Desire, A Haunting. Molly holds master's degrees in fiction and poetry from the University of Cincinnati and George Mason University, respectively, and a PhD in experimental prose from the University of Utah. She is an assistant professor of creative writing and literature at Stony Brook University. To Molly's left is Marcos Gonsalez. He's an essayist and assistant professor of English living in New York City. Marcos's memoir, featuring literary criticism and cultural analysis, Pedro's Theory, is out now with Melville House. Marcos's essays have appeared in Literary Hub, Public Books, Inside Higher Education, Plowshares, Catapult, ASAP Journal, The New Inquiry, and elsewhere. And our final panelist is Charles Coe. He's a poet, prose writer, teacher of writing, and musician. He is the author of 3 books of poetry, All Sins Forgiven, Poems for My Parents, Picnic on the Moon, and Memento Mori, all published by Leapfrog Press. He was a 2017 artist in residence for the city of Boston and is an adjunct professor of English at Salve Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island, where he teaches in the MFA program. So thank you to all our panelists, and I will turn it over to Molly.
Hi, thank you for that, and thank you all for joining us this morning. I'll just introduce, I'm just going to read from the book that I'm wrapping up now. It's the 3rd book in a linked sort of series. My first 2 books were novels in verse with dresses made out of flowers and magical realism, but there was a minor character in both of those books. So the first book is narrated by the mother, second book narrated by her daughter. There's a minor character from both of those that is now the central character in this project. This project is a memoir with a novel inside of it, and the character is the protagonist of the novel. Really, the project is about if there are holes in what you can share when you're writing nonfiction. If you're unwilling to disclose, for example, your trauma, if it's not for consumption, right, for public consumption, or if, I'm adopted, so there are just some gaps in my history. How do you write nonfiction then? And how malleable might that genre be? And how is it that fiction might allow you to get at some of those emotional truths in a way that the nonfiction might fail? So this is just the very beginning of chapter 1. In February 2014, after being single for years, I began seeing a man who was divorced, nearing 40, and feeling his own clock ticking. When I read online that the chances of everyone's first marriage working out aren't great, but that divorced men tend to stick with their second wives until the end, I got over the fact of his divorce pretty fast. He had moved to Salt Lake City for a job, and it paid well enough, he told me, to support a family. A few months later, I would turn him into The Portuguese Lover, but The Portuguese Lover is a fiction. Everything about The Portuguese Lover is a fiction. Everything's a story. You are a story, I'm a story. After I learned that he always carried a Sharpie so that he could draw dick and balls on something, on anything in every public building he went into, I opted out and never saw him again. Sometime later, I was invited to dinner by the man I would end up dating for the next 16 months. And this man would become the young lover. Not everything about the young lover is a fiction, least of all the way her body existed only where he touched her. Who said this? That the only way to know when you're done with a book is to have two projects going simultaneously. And then one day when you realize you've been putting all your energy into the new project, that's when you know you're done with the old one. I was getting closer to finishing Desire, and so I decided to move on. I put away that draft to see if it could survive time and distance, and I began preparing a new book. I already had the title, Fitting to Me. As I had done for my first two books, I developed a word bank to help me start generating new pages. I transcribed all the nouns and verbs from Anne Carson's translation of Sappho's poems. I printed them, cut them up like refrigerator poetry magnets, put them in a giant Ziploc bag, and shook, sifted, swirled, mixing and separating as best I could. Then I pulled them out one at a time to transcribe lists of 10 into a notebook. The first word I pulled was dripping. In my notes, I granted myself permission. Go ahead with these words, let them inspire, see what comes. Word list number 1, dripping, younger, lattice, great, lightly, be, purple, come, swear, hair. Preface, fitting to me. I write this novel an offering to the tea house woman, that complicated figure who appears first as bride-to-be in We Take Me Apart, and then years later as widow in Desire Haunting, which I've only just completed. This is a bad period for me. It's the end of a book, and there's a kind of loneliness, as if that closed book were going on still somewhere else, inside me, like an open eye. And so the first word of the tea house woman's story is dripping, which could refer to anything. The faulty kitchen faucet, the basement ceiling of the tea house after the flood, stems of wildflower bouquets pulled putrid from tall white pitchers, her own wet cunt. In fact, dripping refers to Sappho. The word appears twice in our body of work, first in fragment 37 in My Dripping Pain, and again in fragment 119, Cloth Dripping. Regarding fragment 37, Anne Carson tells us the text is cited as Sappho's in the following discussion of words for pain, and the Aeolic writers call pain a dripping, as if a pain wounds because it drips and flows. Translated differently by Mary Barnard, the fragment appears as follows: pain penetrates me drop by drop. In her thesis, The Mary Barnard Translation of Sappho, Angela Christie speculates that Sappho was thinking of dripping stalagmites. Barnard corrects her. I'm sure that she did not have stalagmites in mind, she writes, nor did I. I thought of a faucet dripping in the next room, say, then of a heartbeat, then of the pulse, then of throbbing pain. The comparison is not with a hard stone-pointed object, but with rhythmic liquid movement inside the body. The tea house woman surprises herself by taking a new lover. He is younger than her Portuguese lover, and this morning she lies awake in bed waiting for him to stir. The rising sun through the trellis beyond her bedroom window forms a lattice shadow over her torso. She lifts her hand into the light, watches the pattern of the lines moving over her skin. The motion of her wrist is reminiscent of Catherine the Great's. Upon receiving Marie Antoinette's court painter Louise Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who later wrote, the sight of this famous woman so impressed me, I found it impossible to think of anything. I could only stare at her. The tea house woman slides down along the body of her lover, takes his cock into her mouth and sucks lightly, lips soft as a bee landing on a plum blossom. He is purple, hard, awake. He reaches with both arms and pulls her toward him, onto him. They are, no, we are chest to chest, and I'm in your ear now, whispering, you're gonna make me come. This is new. The tea house woman's husband had always finished first, even on their wedding night, and he apologized the way men do when they come too soon, and she hugged him and felt almost like herself comforting him, until it got to the point where listening to him snore, she would roll over and swear at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that next time would be better. Inevitably, during those early hours and before the rest of the kitchen staff arrived, she found herself downstairs with Nell, letting the older woman console her over a pot of coffee and a plate of hot cinnamon rolls. Imagine the kitchen of a spreading old house in a country town. A great black stove is its main feature, but there's also a big round table and a fireplace with 2 rocking chairs placed in front of it. Well, Nell would say, retrieving the previous night's chocolate trees from the walk-in and placing them on the tops of freshly frosted coconut-dusted cupcakes, have you experimented with this? Or while cutting biscuits out of trifle dough, maybe you could wear that? Eventually, after her suggestion of open and transparent communication backfired, when her young friend, after many weeks, finally mustered her courage to ask her husband if there was anything she should be doing differently in bed, and he, in response, put a hand on her head and told her to stop overthinking it. Yes, finally, even then, Nell threw her hands into the air, where they left little puffs of flour like clouds and said, "Men, what can you do?" "Tell me what I can do for you," you say, your hands clamped around my hips and rocking them forward and back against yours. My hair falling long down the sides of my face, nearly onto your face, your eyes watching mine for instruction signs, and I don't know what I want or how to ask for it until you stop. Stunned, waiting, "Don't stop," I say, and you flip me over still inside me onto my back. Yes, like that, as I push back against you, pulling you closer, yes. Pushing back under your weight and forward, yes, until you fall heavy on top of me. Your eyes finally closing, and they are again chest to chest. And as her young lover rests his left temple in the cradle of her right shoulder and jaw, the tea house woman stares up at the ceiling, caressing his neck and back, thinking, it's only fair for a woman to come more. Think of all the times they didn't care. Thank you.
Let's see if we can get this thing going. Okay. I'm going to read as well, but I think I'll preface it with some thoughts about the difference between, fact and fiction. For me, that question is one of, am I too far, too close? I'm too close. No. The approach for me is one of craft, right? How can you incorporate elements of what the details of your life, of your experience, right? And oftentimes, for so many of us, right, our familial histories, our family stories are absent, or there's different gaps in your story or your family's story. So you have to do the work of figuring out how to imagine them into existence, right? Sometimes when they're not available. So I was working with trying to figure out my father, who's from Mexico, his past, when he cannot read or write. I was the first person in my family to be able to read or write. And so there's no history of us, right? Literally, I'm the first person who starts to document any kind of history. So for me, a lot of the work of uncovering our past was from scattered photos that an aunt from Mexico would send me, little, like word of mouth stories that you would hear. So it was relatively this really difficult process of recovery. And I tried to stop thinking of it as recovery, but kind of imagining, speculating, right? I thought of it as like an experiment. I was hypothesizing on my own life. And so I approached this book of mine, Pedro's theory, as, right, and that's why I call it a theory, right? It's the theory of how you excavate a life, your family's life, when there is so little record, there is so little seemingly to your history, right? And that's not true, though. I know there's a history, I know there are stories, but they're not available to me. So that was the process I undertook, and the way I thought about it was a kind of experiment. And a lot of the parts throughout the book are me writing to photos of family members, right? So I write to an image of my father before he's my father, right? When he's really young. I write to a picture of my mother when she's really young, and thinking about who they were, right, in this moment in their life and what that process of trying to imagine them was. So this is called To My Mother. I have never known you to be a quirky person. Hot-headed, yes, assertive, and never wrong, certainly, but never the quirky photo of you that I see here. Where's this taken? At the movie theater, the carnival? Is it the late 70s or early 80s? The overalls, the curly hair, the frown smile, figuration of lips. I can't stop looking at this black and white photo booth picture of you because I can't make heads or tails of your countenance. I don't know what your face is trying to tell the viewer. This is not the mother I know. Then and now, you have always loved photo booths. Anytime we go to the movie theater or the mall, you pop your head in the booth to check the prices. Odds are you find them too expensive, which odds are they are. There's a photo booth photo of us from around 2006 when I'm first starting high school, and we are both smiling. My cheek is squashed up against your cheek. The flash is too strong, so the image makes us look like we are drowning in light. We look content. I'm sure we are in that exact moment, but the photograph masks the historical context in which it's taken. The recent death of your son, my brother, you losing your job due to the depression, the unimaginable mourning. I, the fat and feminine son, the one with too much swish in my hip and verve in my voice, and the only son that's left for you, the source of pain for you. You taking out your frustrations and pains on me. The photo booth stages an encounter of participation. The person being photographed knows it is coming and they want it. They have paid for it after all. So they smile, so they pose, so they do their thing, whatever that thing may be, hoping it will give them the best photographic outcome. Serious if you want, goofy if you like, a little bit mopey if you choose. Whatever look you want to give, you give it, because it is just for an instant, a moment. By doing so, you create another self, one that is not your everyday self, perhaps, one not riddled by depressive frowns or the happy-go-lucky smile. The photographed subject doesn't have to give the same look they give on a daily basis in the photo booth. The photo booth lets you play a character, an emotion, a style, where you become a stranger in a familiar body for a very brief moment. But you know this better than I do, you chameleon. Your younger self there in the photo booth with quirky countenance, the only example of such a look in your photographic archive I can find. All the other photos I find of this period of your life, or of you at all, are serious face poses, staged smiles. That's the mother I know. The mother who acts first and thinks later. The mother whose mood and attitude can change like the flick of a light switch. The mother quick to use her hands to solve her problems. But in this black and white quirkiness, you become unfamiliar to me. You are the oddball photographer. You are the Puerto Rican girl as artist, not my mother I have come to know. And now I'm juxtaposing it with another photo of me, with a photo of me. My childhood self is looking over the bare shoulder with what appears to be a surprised face, like my grandmother in the kitchen, wondering what you are doing, why this photo here and now. But you know why. You are a photographer. You can see the perfect picture in a moment. The careful attention on my exposed body, the turning of the shoulder, the turning into a posed vulnerability, my face suspended in disbelief or wonder or something else. I am grateful to you for this photograph, Mom. This photo gives me a different portrait of myself to work with, one that does not just have to be the ridiculed and violated body my classmates make of me in school. In this photograph, I can be the fat and shy and feminine body made beautiful, aestheticized for all that I am. The tenderness and intimacy of your photographic aesthetic is an unusual emotional register for the mother I know. I get to know you differently this way. I get to have a different relation to you than the one we must have day to day. Here is the quirky photographer of the photo booth. Here is the overall wearing artist paying close attention to scene and subject, the wanting to produce a certain kind of effect, the distinctive capturing of the moment where suspense becomes surprise, where mother sees daughter and mother sees son, where son sees his mother as the photographer, as the artist creating him in a moment gone by. My brother is everything a mother could want and more in a boy child. He is overwhelmingly masculine. He gets girlfriends easily, he wants a family someday, but all of this is cut short on one quiet October day in 2004, and there is no longer the son of the collective imagination within the house. I am too feminine, too fat, too gay, too introverted to be anyone's dream of futurity. So much so that the summer before I had graduated college, in the heated moments of an argument about my departure, you say, "I wish you died instead of him." We mean what we say the most when we are in the heat of rage. I know you meant those words that summer day. Those words that will never leave me. I know I'm not the son you wanted. I can never be the son you imagined me to be in the womb all those years. It has taken me a long time to come to terms with the fact, but what has helped this process of understanding is knowing this is not exclusively of your doing. We have all inherited a common assumption of what it means to be a son, a boy, a bedroll in the Americas. Bedros are tough, Bedros don't cry, Bedros are to keep the bloodline going. If this is followed, then the Bedro and his family can be closer to being respectable, perhaps can survive in this country, in this colonized condition. What if I tell you, Mom, that you and your mother have more in common than you think? Your mother favored her boys because she, like you, like many, believed in the inherent value of the masculine. You can see, right, how the mother's cherishing of the boy carries down to the daughter who becomes mother next. And how they value the boy and the masculine is different, taking shape to fit a context and a situation. The way my childhood body moves and how I speak is picked apart by you. Boys don't cry, you'll say to me. Boys don't play with dolls, you will tell me. Don't walk with such a swish in your hip, don't hang your hand like that, don't do this or don't do that, they might give it away. You are not the little macho Pedro, the little Pedro every mother fantasizes about having. After my first year away at college, I returned over the summer to tell you I'm queer. You cry and ask me why I didn't tell you sooner. I find this response disingenuous, given your track record of policing my body. From where comes this sudden change of heart? I think my year away from the house gives you time to reflect on my absence, to come to terms with my feminine and gay body, to think upon the subject of your little failed Pedro. I know you are afraid to lose me. You see how eager I am to leave the small town life, how easily I acclimate to being away in New York City, and maybe you think my grandmother is right, that I am a wanderer, an andariego, that I can pick up and go where I need to, leaving behind who I must to live truthfully, to live free. A year away in college and you never make remarks again about how I walk or how I move my hands or how I sound or who I date. Whatever prompted your change of heart, I'm grateful for it. I'm not the Pedro you wished for, Mom, and I will never be. I cannot be my brother and I have no interest in being a man's man as my brother was. I am the Pedro who swishes his hips. I am the Pedro who gestures with his hands a bit too much, a bit too extravagantly. I am the Pedro who does not want children and does not want the white picket fence. I am the Pedro creating my own story as best as I can. As the world has come between my father and me, so the world comes between us, as it does for everyone. If this photo booth image is but a moment for you, Mom, happenstance capturing of quirkiness, an exception to your norm, then I write especially to this image to give you another timeline, another way of being together. Writing to the young quirky girl in the photo booth who will someday become my mother. Writing to the quirky photographer who I've never known and he only knows a black and white image. The girl who likes to have fun, the girl who pays dutiful attention to details, the girl who celebrates the differences in others. The girl in the photo booth who reminds me we are many selves, and some of those selves get lost through time. Writing to the lost girl, knowing what it is to be lost, to have a version of your childhood self taken away from you, and not knowing how to go back and reclaim it. I write this to the photographer in the photo booth. I write this to the Puerto Rican girl as artist, to the girl who I will someday call my mother. Thank you.
Both of you are fabulous. I could listen to an hour of that. Good morning, everyone. First things first, I'd like to thank Anthony for inviting us to share this time with you. And I also have to throw some props to the people who put this festival together. Last night, the readings were incredible, and the community feeling that seemed to exist here is really something special. So my hats off for all of you who put that together. I'm going to do a couple of things this morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of truth in memoir, which I think is a very interesting and endlessly discussable idea. And then I'm going to read a few memoir poems I've written about my late sister Carol, who died 10 years ago of liver cancer. I'm working on a prose memoir of the family that focuses on her, but I'm going to share some of the poems I've written in some other books this morning. So I'm thinking about what's true in a memoir. One question is, can a memoir be true without being 100% factually accurate? And by true, maybe we mean that to the best of the writer's ability, this book is an honest account of the dynamics of the relationships described and the major events that help shape that writer's life. So, when you crack your knuckles and you sit down to start writing a memoir, these are some things that, some questions that are going to come up for you. Now, when you read a memoir in which the writer's describing a conversation the night when they were 10, and their parents sat them at the kitchen table to announce they were separating, well, the writer wasn't sitting there with the tape recorder. 30 years later, transcribing that recording for the memoir, we all understand as readers that what the writer put down was something that was not a transcription. It was conveying the essential truth of the interaction. Other times you might shift the chronology of certain events to make for a smoother narrative flow, but you're still conveying something that's essentially true about the situational dynamics. But then we sort of start sliding into some gray areas. What about a situation where a writer wants to talk about a high school teacher who had a great influence on them for good or ill, and the writer invents a situation or a conversation that accurately captures the dynamic of the relationship, but it never actually happened? I mean, is that okay? Now, when we start getting into sort of really dicey areas is when, for whatever reason, the writer tries to recast the dynamics themselves. Maybe the writer was a so-so athlete who was always chosen last for the schoolyard basketball games, but claims in the memoir that they were one of the better players on the court, and invents this heroic scenario where they win a certain game with the last second shot. Well, to me, that's not okay. I think many of us would say, well, that's just lying. I mean, that's the 10-cent word we would use to describe that. And if you go even farther down this road, you wind up in James Frey territory. I think most of us remember that Frey was the author of a book called A Million Little Pieces back in 2003 that was marketed as a memoir of drug addiction, crime, and an eventual journey to sobriety. Oprah featured it in her book club. In that book, he claimed he hit a police officer with his car while high on crack, got into a violent fight with other officers, and spent 90 days in jail. The only problem is none of that ever happened. A police report showed that he spent 5 hours in the clink and paid a few $100 fine for some minor offenses. And the arresting officer recalled him as having been polite and cooperative. So Oprah had him back on her show to grill him about all this. And he claimed that he'd embellished some details, but the point of the book was to talk about his drug addiction. That was the main idea. Oprah wasn't having it. Now, I gotta hand it to this dude. I wouldn't have gone on Oprah's show and been eviscerated on national television. So I will give him that. But as far as what's truthful in a memoir, his book, to me, obviously failed the sniff test. Writers of memoir need to be able to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, have I told this story with honesty and integrity? Have I been rigorous when called for and compassionate when called for? Have I made stuff up to make myself or someone else look better or worse? Have I owned up to the fact that I wasn't always the hero of the story? And there's one last thing. Spicing up a story, as he did, is a cop-out. The challenge to us as memoirists is to find the poetry in ordinary life. As most of us probably heard in our first English comp classes, it's not what happened that makes a story interesting. It's how you write about what happened. So with that, I'm going to share a few poems about my late sister, Carol. This is My Sister Read to Me. Nestled in my sister's lap while she read a picture book or fairy tale, I traced trails across the pages that carried me to other worlds. I don't know how or when my sister's path carried her away from sun and sky to some strange world where light never reaches, where needles and spoons and burning candles are the nodding faithful's machinery of prayer. For a long time, she never read at all, just lay in bed behind a closed door, television glowing in the darkened room. But then something changed. Now she emerges from her cave like a bear in spring, hungry, a bit confused, wincing at the unaccustomed light, shielding eyes that discourage questions, yet reveal all. Rise up, daughter of Cleopatra, who challenged mighty Rome. Daughter of sojourner truth, whose white-hot gaze pierced the heart. Daughter of Artemis, goddess of the hunt, arrows flying straight and true. Rise up, daughter of ancient women warriors. My sister who read to me and opened doors you could not walk through yourself. Doppelganger for Carol. Standing in the checkout line, mind drifting but jarred from waking sleep by the sight of a woman who looked exactly like you. The same slim, wiry frame and step-aside walk, the same heart-shaped face framed by an undisciplined shock of brown curls, the same half smile broadcasting both welcome and warning. I couldn't look away, horrified and intrigued at the thought our eyes might meet. But your doppelganger never even glanced my way. It would have been nothing to see. No thread of connection reaching across the supermarket aisles, binding us as I am bound to you. Gone these many years, lying quietly in the shade of an oak tree atop a wind-blown hill. Late that night, I looked at your number, still in my phone, a digital ghost forever roaming cyberspace. And for a moment, I was tempted to call. If I did and heard your voice, what would I say? And how would you answer? And this is the title poem of my latest book of poetry, Memento Mori. 1. According to legend, a Roman general who won a great battle would be paraded through the city, standing in a chariot, waving to the tens of thousands lining the boulevard, cheering, shouting his name. Behind him would stand a common soldier, sometimes a slave, holding a crown above the general's head in a gently mocking gesture and whispering in his ear to keep his vanity and pride in check. Remember, you must die. 2. There's a tiny bump on the back of my right hand, invisible to the eye. Years ago, when I was being prepped for brain surgery, a catheter was inserted there, and the bump remains. Sometimes when I'm tired or bored or anxious, I'll realize my finger's been moving over it slowly, back and forth, stroking it like a talisman, a reminder to make the most of this never to be repeated day. 3. The late afternoon light that slants through the blinds, painting zebra stripes on the dining room table, takes me back to my sister's last day, when she lay in the hospital bed and the sunlight streaming through the window illuminated the salt and pepper hair, wispy and dry, spread out against her pillow. And finally, the night my sister danced with a mouse. The night my sister danced like a mouse began like any ordinary Sunday evening. Our folks were in the kitchen, sipping coffee, taking a break from their kids. My sister Carol and I were in the living room, polishing off our Swanson frozen turkey TV dinners and watching that guy on the Ed Sullivan Show spin dinner plates on the end of sticks while the orchestra charged through the Hungarian fire dance. Just as each wobbly plate seemed about to tumble off its stick and crash to earth, he'd give a little flick with his finger to keep it moving. Little did we know that while we sat entranced by Plate Man's battle with gravity, a little brown mouse was creeping across the living room, headed for an epic struggle of its own, a struggle that commenced when Carol glanced down, noticed it tugging at the cuff of her pajama bottom, and levitated. No other verb will do, off the sofa. The start of mouse headed north instead of south, scrabbling up the inside of her pants. Get it out, get it out, get it out, she explained, and tried to evict her uninvited guest with a series of improv dance steps that, had James Brown seen, he would have given up showbiz and opened a hardware store. I can't swear her feet ever touched the floor. When I realized what was happening, I fell off the sofa and rolled on the floor, gasping for air. At the time, Carol was 13, and 4 years younger, I was a card-carrying member of the annoying Little Brothers Club. When our parents ran in from the kitchen to see what the fuss was about, they were greeted by the sight of their daughter, an airborne, wild-eyed dervish, and their son stretched out on the carpet, flopping like a beached bluefish. The show ended when the mouse finally dropped from Carol's pants and zoomed out of the living room, a near invisible brown blur. Over the years, the night my sister danced with the mouse became part of our family's personal mythology, a shorthand reminder that we were connected by gravitational fields of laughter and memory in ways we were connected to no one else. That we were not merely 4 plates spinning off in our separate and solitary dances. Thank you.
Thank you all for those beautiful readings. I have a couple of questions, but I want to give the audience kind of first dibs if they have questions for our panelists. So if you do, just raise your hand and I'd be happy to call on you. Yes.
Yeah, I have this question about there being a memoir when people are still alive. And can you do that? And what kind of reaction? For example, if your sister was here or your brother and they heard this, what kind of reaction? And can you do a memoir when people are still alive? And because you're perceiving things differently than those people have.
That's the $64,000 question, ain't it? You guys want to take a shot?
Well, I wrote, my mother's still very much alive.
Okay, what was your
My
reaction?
mother still very much calls me every day, she still antagonizes me all the time. I told her, I was like, this, I wrote to a lot of people who are still living. I think the thing I said was, right, this is my story. Right, and I think you said it really well, Charles, right? Like, how do you approach this with rigor? And I think you said honesty, right? And I think for me, I also add on into there, how do you extend grace to those who may have harmed you, to those who may have hurt you, right? Who are still living, right? And how do you speak about that honestly? And so for me, that chapter about my mother was that effort to do that, right? To say that I'm going to do this work of talking about the past and figuring it out, right? And I need to do it honestly, right? And the really mean and nasty things are said, right? And those are true. But what also is true, and that's why I really like this idea of like fictionalized memoir, is who was my mother when she was 18, right? She might have been this woman who was so open to difference and she looked passionate, right? Like, she's a woman that I didn't know. But if I did know, maybe that gives me a different impression of her. So for me, it was that kind of way of writing about living people and trying to extend grace, and especially in trying to understand who they might have been or who they could have been if things maybe were a little bit different. Or
who they are. I mean, we perceive people in one way, and they may be different, completely different. I mean, we have our blinders on because we can't read their minds, and we have our view of them, of who they are. And is that, how real is that versus, it's hard to know that.
Well, when you write a memoir, it's not right up like recto verso, left, right. On this side is my story, my sense of what happened. And this is the side where they get to say, well, no, it wasn't exactly like that, or they get to add some details. That's not what happened. So it's all you. So you have, I think, a responsibility if there are difficult aspects to your relationship, to write with ruthless compassion, as the Buddhist might say. And to remember that even people who do damaged people who do damage are damaged people. There's no such thing as a happy bully. So if you're writing about someone who's harmed you, I think it's important as a writer to realize that, to think about how did they get to be that way. So that's how they felt they needed to move through the world. And to get to your first question about writing about people when they're still alive, there may be times when you need to wait till a certain person is no longer with us. But if you're going to write that story while they're around, you need to write the story that needs to be written. If you half-step it, it'll be insipid. You need to tell the truth, and whatever that truth is for you. And if you need to wait until somebody's no longer around to do that, then so be it. But don't do it halfway. And people will get mad sometimes. You can't guarantee that they won't get mad. And you have to ask yourself if you're willing to see some fallout, sometimes serious fallout, in your relationship with people you're writing about.
Yes.
Marcus, you use the term fictionalized memoir. Is that the same as creative nonfiction?
I don't know if I used that term. Maybe I did. Is that the same thing as what?
Creative nonfiction.
Creative nonfiction. Well, I think creative nonfiction is, they're not the same, right? Like a fictionalized memoir, I imagine would be, did I say it? I don't know if I did.
You start with creative nonfiction.
I think creative nonfiction, right, is like, I'm going to approach this material, whether it's historical material, like a biography, and I'm going to write in a creative lyrical mode. So there's like biographies that are written this way, right, like historical books too. So I think with my book, it is creative nonfiction, in that I'm trying to bring in history, right? I'm trying to understand migration and how my family ended up here, right? Like putting those things into the conversation. And one of them, right, is I don't have an archive, I don't have photo albums, I don't have a lot of material in which to work with. So I do have to fictionalize it a little, right? And I fictionalize it by looking at other source materials, other texts, right? So like looking at how other Mexican-American writers write about their stories, and I compare it to mine, right? Like what are the similarities? How might they help me understand myself better? So I think when I say it's fictionalized, I'm using other materials, other sources in order to understand my life. So for me, it's always, my background is I'm a literary scholar. So for me, it's always about research, right? And how can I research all this material and put it side by side with what I'm doing? And so it might be in conversation with what you're doing, Molly, a little bit in terms of like a novel within a memoir. But for me, it's research, and it's putting it into conversation with what I'm doing with my own life.
So it's not historical fiction because you're bringing yourself into it.
Yeah, it's definitely not historical fiction, right? So like I'm not narrating like, the Mexican independence movement or anything like that. But it's saying that these different historical, right? So NAFTA, right? The North American Free Trade Agreement in the 90s is what prompted my father to like come here. So like that historical event, I contextualize it and say like, this helps me understand why my father came here better, right? So like trying to put in the world around me. That's what I'm doing.
So we have time for one more question from the audience. Yes.
So when writing fiction, how can you get the audience to sort of care about the plot once they might separate it from the author's personal metaphor? Because the fear is that once they get it, they're going to start becoming ignorant to the rest of the plot, living in the "oh, I get it" this other plot.
Anybody want to tackle that one?
I mean, I have a quick soundbite for that. the mystery of the plot is never as interesting as the mystery of the heart. So somebody figuring out what the plot is, okay, you know, I would say with the exception of the mystery novel, but any plot of any story, fiction or nonfiction, it is okay if the reader kind of figures it out, because what we're there for, page by page by page, is how is this character dealing with that plot event or the story event? How do they feel about that? How are they reacting to that? How do they deal with these human scenarios and get through them?
Yeah, you know, and popular fiction and literary fiction have different conventions. If you're reading a mystery novel or a romance novel, you don't expect this protagonist you've been following for 6 novels to get brutally murdered at the end of the story. You know there's going to be a happy ending. The mystery's going to get solved. The couple's going to fall in love and get married and move to Jersey City or whatever. And sometimes the difference between popular fiction and literary fiction is a happy ending as opposed to maybe a happy ending or maybe a tragic ending. But a lot of times it's not really about plot. Like if you want to reread a Jane Austen novel, you're not reading it to find out what happened, because you know what happened. You're reading it because you want to be in that world. You know, you want to savor that language and to be in that world. So that's an interesting question. I don't think there's a textbook answer to it. I think it's a question of, you know, what you said. It's okay if people figure out what happens. They can still enjoy the ride.
Yeah, I think with like the mixed genre, like, you know, fiction, history, like memoir, like mixing all these things together, like finding the plot is even harder. Like, or like finding some kind of plot structure. Like for me, when I was writing my book, I was like, you know, how do I narrate this in a way that is somewhat thrilling, or like, you know, like it was just my childhood story, essentially what I was saying. So I was just thinking of different points in which I think, as you said, Molly, really well, like, you know, how do you make this something about the heart, right? How do you compel this person, the reader, to want to be a part of what you're doing, right? And so they will follow you if it's, you know, if your heart is in it and you know, what you're trying to do, right? So if you're trying to do a mixed genre kind of work, right, and you trust that, write it, right? You go for it, and then later you figure out how to move it around and you know, tweak it to make it for a plot structure. But I think that's the difficult part with doing this kind of mixed genre stuff is the plot is really hard to, I think, configure early on, because you're doing, you know, innovative and weird stuff that's exciting.
Can I ask Molly a question? Molly, what process did you go through to decide that was the structure that you wanted to take? That's the approach you wanted to take to your book.
I had the fiction, and then I had some nonfiction, and they seemed to make sense together. It was a light bulb moment. It really was for me. But my first 2 books were novels in verse, so it made sense on a sort of intellectual, who am I as a writer? What is it that I'm doing? Why am I doing it? And for me, you know, one of the important questions is always, how can we teach people how to read all over again? So that when we encounter something, anything, that we think we understand what it is, that project can sort of make somebody start over with, in this case, reading a book. What does it mean to read a book? What does it mean to read a fiction? How can it teach me to take it and accept it on its own terms and blur these categories, which I think is an important exercise for being alive in the world today, to break down those categories and expectations. So it made sense to me to bridge 2 genres.
I love that. I wish we had more time to keep this conversation going, but we have to wrap it up. I want to thank our panelists. Thank you all for coming. We will be around the festival, so if you see us, feel free to keep the conversation going. But thank you again, and enjoy the rest of the festival.